Welcome to Obsession Engineering. It's no secret that I like an Aprilia, and luckily so does my mate Tim. So he has treated himself to this lovely brand new RSV4, and I get to turn it into a track bike. Yay! So even though the basic architecture of the bike hasn't evolved massively in the 12 years they've been making it, it has been detailed constantly. So compared to the early bikes, obviously it's 100cc bigger. The engine is really quite a lot different inside. So crank, rods, pistons, cylinder heads, gearbox, they're all different to how they used to be. And basically they've gone through, they've fixed the niggles and got more power. So the engine is now really, really well developed. The electronics are obviously cleverer with more stuff to fiddle with. There is still a good selection of buttons, and they have kept the up and down buttons on here, which make it really easy doing traction control changes on the fly. If we turn it on, obviously we have a TFT dashboard, very much like the 660s and everything have. So that's all nice and fancy and modern. Obviously the brakes and bits like that have been brought up to date. So you've got the latest Styrma, or whatever they call them, calipers. The forks and bits on this one is like the basic stuff because it's not the electronically adjusted Öhlins and bits. And even though these are the cast wheels, not the forged ones, they're actually quite light. There's not that much difference, and especially for the price difference, there's nothing wrong at all with these cast wheels. The frame may look exactly the same as the early bikes, but of course they've always had the option to adjust headstock, position and angle. The yokes are probably different, I haven't actually checked. They've always had adjustment for swinging arm pivot and engine position, and so without actually changing the main sort of spars and bits of the frame, they've always been able to adjust the stuff that really matters. And the latest generation bikes also have these lovely underslung swinging arms, which I think looks very MotoGP. So I'm looking forward to getting this in pieces and making it even more special. Back in 2013, I raced an RSV4 for 3 years. I did the TT and Ulster Grand Prix and Scarborough and all sorts on it, and it was just lovely. It's so much more involving than your normal four-cylinder Jap and German stuff, because this engine makes such a wonderful noise and the bike's just brilliant. In the end I did copy everybody else and got a BMW, but I still have a major soft spot for these things, which is also part of the reason I have a Toronto V4 on the road. To be fair, it would be perfectly capable of turning up at a track day tomorrow, if the weather was nice enough, and going around in the fast group and being really, really fast. But Tim also, luckily, likes his bling, so we are going to be changing fork internals, rear shock, exhaust system, bodywork, rear sets, handlebars and a few other bits. So Tim has been watching my instructional videos on the internet, and he's becoming more and more confident with stripping down bits of his own bikes. So he's going to be doing some of the work on this. He's going to be removing the bodywork, and he'll be probably bolting rear sets and bits like that on, and I'll be the one getting involved in the more technical stuff, the bouncy bits up and down and the stuff that might be a bit more complicated, like the exhaust system. So it will be a bit of a partnership getting the bike built, but we're going to show you as much as we can, and when it's done, it's going to be awesome. This video was actually filmed back in March 2023, and as we watched Tim diligently taking his bodywork off, being very careful not to get really stressed or break any little fasteners off, I'm going to make a bit of a confession. In the time since we shot the video, I've lost some of the footage. So unfortunately you're going to have to take my word for it that I did the following things. Got the bike running at ActiveForce Racing. Fitted a full Aprilia system. Put a Gabbro map in it. Fitted a Spider top yoke. Some Spider clip-ons. Some Jet Prime switchgear. A Jet Prime quick action throttle. Dimag wheels. And of course the most important thing for any track bike is the suspension. And this is definitely no different, because this has K-Tech DDS fork kit fitted at Obsession Engineering. But enough about the things I forgot, let's get back to the workshop. Morning! I'd like to tell you it is the morning after I started this. It's not. I prioritised doing another job, and then I went racing for the weekend. So this is the week after I started, and now I really do have a deadline to get Tim's bike finished. But I think we'll make some decent progress because I did all the really awkward jobs the other day. Apart from taking the ABS off. Taking the ABS off might be a bit awkward, so that's the job I'm going to do next. And to start, I've already taken the front wheel out, basically because I've got to have half the front end apart, and it just gives me a little bit more access into pulling pipes and maybe dropping the radiator out and stuff like that. So that's it. Let's get involved in some ABS pipes. The ABS module is staying in with the pump attached to it, and we're just taking the pipe work out so that we can convert it to normal brake lines and basically not use the ABS. So what we're going to do is disconnect all of these. I'm going to put blanks in under the banjo so any fluid in the pump stays in the pump, but then I've got to get the hoses off. So when I had all the airbox and everything off here, I've already been underneath and snipped a couple of cable ties that were holding the lines underneath where the wiring loom runs. But I'm kind of hoping that I can fathom these out and sort of pull them along and out this way and not have to take either the wiring loom or the engine out, because that would be a pig of a job. When I disconnect the brake lines from the calipers, I'm also going to take the standard pistons out of the calipers and fit these titanium castellated drilled pistons into the calipers. And the idea is that these will stop some of the heat getting into the caliper and, you know, should make the brakes more consistent. And they're also quite bling, although you won't be able to see it. Still, nice things. Brake fluid is hideous stuff, and so when I'm pulling the pipes out, so I don't end up with brake fluid sort of pretty much everywhere over the bike, I've cut the fingers off a pair of gloves, or off a glove, and taped them onto the end of the pipes. So hopefully that'll keep that a bit tidier. And now what I've got to do is fashion out or work out which ones go where, and then try and feed them back through the bike and out the front and out the back, so we can get everything out the way. There are no longer ABS pipes running around here because I have managed to get them out. I've taken the bolt out the top of the radiator, so I've just got a little bit of movement so I could actually get the radiator, the hose ends, sorry, not the radiator ends, the hose ends out the hole. And it wasn't too bad because I'd already snipped the cable ties under here. There was a cable tie either side of the radiator which were slightly fiddly, but once I'd got those, you could actually feed the pipes out fairly easily. So I've got them sticking out of the bin at the moment, just draining. The rear ones are out now, but I am not touching the rear brake just yet. But I have taken the rear set off because we don't need any of that, because we've got a different rear brake and different rear set. But being an Aprilia, we will need the rear brake light switch still connected, because if you disconnect that, it throws up a fault code. So, little trick, leave that just taped up and under the back of the bike somewhere. That is the castellated brake pistons fitted, so they're kind of nice, and the idea is they'll put less heat into the caliper so you get less brake fade. So that's rather nice, and they're going to be bolted onto the standard discs, but on the Diamag wheels I've fitted with some titanium disc bolts as well. And this assembly, front wheel, tyre, discs, bolts, all of it, is 1.1 kilograms lighter than the standard wheel, so it's basically a 10% saving, because the original assembly is 11.2 kilos, this is 10.1, so 10% reduction in unsprung weight, definitely worth having. I now have a front brake, everything's bled up nicely and everything's nice and tight down the bottom. Put the mudguard back on, that's a proper nice carbon mudguard there, not the original plastic one. I haven't put the span adjuster on yet because I'm not going to do that until I put the clock back on to make sure it doesn't hit with the cable, and I'm not putting the clock back on until I've worked out where I'm putting the ignition switch, because it's not going there, but that's probably next on the list. Right, I have run a brake line from the thumb brake, like the scooter brake, sorry, and I run it along, basically paired up with the clutch line, so it runs down here, along here, and to the caliper down there. But I can't bleed that up because the Tygon tubing that I use as the reservoir is in the van, and I'm not in the van today, I'm on my bike, so that's a job for in the morning. Right, I think the next thing to do before I do the ignition switch is put the back wheel back in. Diamag rear wheel to go in it, different pitch 520 pitch chain. That assembly is 3 kilograms lighter than the standard one. Well, I'm just under, like 2.8 kilograms lighter than the standard wheel. There will be a bit of variation in tyres, admittedly, but changing a pair of wheels has saved basically 4 kilograms of unsprung rotating mass, and that is worth having. Occasionally the job sort of decides its own route. I wanted to get the back wheel back in, so there was a back wheel in it, and that led to having to change the chain and the front sprocket. The Dimag has come with a 43 rear sprocket on it, and we're having a 16 front. The suggestion came from John Coughlin at Bikers World, who races one of these and knows them a bit better than I do. So I couldn't put the wheel in with the chain on it, the old chain on it, because it wouldn't go long enough to get the adjuster in the block. So then I had to cut the chain off it, so therefore I'm changing the chain and sprocket, so we're now on that gearing, and we were also told to run the swinging arm fairly well back, so we're in the middle there, chain adjustment's done, and I've wire locked that in so that the block stays on the spindle when you do a wheel change. On this side, titanium wheel nut, titanium caliper bolts, a little sort of pin to guide the spindle in it a little bit easier, and when I remember to bring some 4mm screws tomorrow, I will be blocking the adjuster block to the caliper bracket so that everything stays in place when we come to do a wheel change. And that means I've had to trim some out of the carbon hugger, because the chain guard that was on here came that far into the wheel, you had to take the caliper off to get the wheel in and out, and that was really not practical on a track bike, so I've cut that off. I did ask for permission first though. I've also had to write a list of outstanding work, because I kept remembering there was more than I sort of initially think there is, but bit by bit I can tick all these off, and then hopefully the list will get shorter, not longer. I think what I'm going to do next though is the ignition switch that I was going to do about 2 hours ago. It actually feels like I'm making some forward progress for a change, because this bit's actually gone relatively quickly and to plan. Now, we didn't want the kill switch on the yoke because the yoke is racy, but it has fitted there basically onto some brackets that the headlights or whatever would normally fit to, so that's pretty sturdy. Push button start, and the nice thing is I haven't had to extend any wiring because it all just disappears into the back of the clock assembly anyway. Now the ignition switch, the immobiliser section, so we've still got the key in the key barrel bit, so you have to drill that off the yoke, but that's fitted relatively easily. That's the headlight eliminator, so that the bike actually thinks the headlight's still connected. All the wiring for the switch gears is tucked into the orifices, or the hollows in there. So that's all tickety-boo, and I've put a screen protector on the dash just to stop it getting scratched as easily if one day it disappears through the gravel. There is supposed to be a dash protector going for it, but it hasn't landed yet. So with that electronics done, in theory we could start the bike if I put the ECU back on there, but I'm not doing that yet because I actually need to take the top of the airbox off again, because we have the Gabbro stacks, and having looked at the internet, or more actually having had Tim, the owner, tell me to look at the internet, these come out, and then some extra little bungs that came in the pack with the bell mouths block the holes off, so I can take them out. It gives you some more airbox capacity. Well, that's the first stage of funnels removed, or second stage, whatever you want to call them, and the little bung down the bottom of there. So the airbox lid is now airtight and has a greater capacity, so that can go back on there, and I can put the ECU and bits back on. Winner! ECU reconnected, airbox all fitted, all the connectors apart from that one, which I'm sure I will find a home for in a minute. They go on the back of the fuel tank. I have made some plugs, some little blanks to replace the banjos on the ABS pump, so that won't leak when we get some ignition on. So up here we have the GPS receiver for the lap timer. This should see through the fiberglass of the seat unit. Generally they'll see through fiberglass but not carbon. If it doesn't work when Tim's out riding it, he'll have to remove the wiring. There's plenty of wiring, and just run it and sit it on top of the seat unit, but hopefully it'll work sat there. With the fuel tank connected, I've decided it's time to see if it actually starts. We have ignition in a fuel pump, so that's definitely a bonus to begin with. Right, we're in neutral. And we have a running bike, so that's always a good sign. That's the end of another surprisingly long day working on the RSV4, but I have smashed quite a lot of the list off, and I think I've got through even more of the awkward stuff. So basically what is left is bleed the rear brake up, which means I've got to bring some reservoir pipe tomorrow. I've got a mod to captive the rear caliper, I need to fit the rear sets and the shock, and then there's just a few little minor details, like an oil and filter service and stuff like that. But it should be just a few hours work. Sit rep. It's Wednesday. That's going to Spain on Saturday. I best get cracking. I think what I'm going to do today is prioritise the jobs that the bike can't go to Spain without being done. So I'm going to locate the reg rec actually on the bike, so it's fastened. And then I'm going to put the rear shock in it, and I'm going to sort the back brake out and a few little bits. And then we're going to do the nicety jobs later. Hopefully later today, not later in a couple of months though. As is pretty common nowadays, the reg rec normally sits in the fairing. We don't have that bit of the fairing anymore, so it needs to sit there, or in fact there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a bracket that comes off these mounting points here to fix the reg rec. These mounting points originally, back on the earlier bikes, were for the fly-by-wire potentiometer, but this bike doesn't have that, so these are no longer in use, which means I can utilise them. So that is my bracket made up, and it's a little bit rough around the edges. It's not the finest bracket I've ever made, but the idea is that when Tim has finished riding this around in Spain, when he's got a couple of weeks back in Blighty, we'll send this off to Jolly and it'll get copied in pre-preg carbon. So I've got the reg rec nicely mounted and tucked all the wiring and bits out the way as best I can. I've moved on to the rear brake thing because I've actually got the bits I need for it today. So got a reservoir mounted up there off a Palm Performance bracket, got some Tygon tubing because that doesn't sweat or go mental. So the next thing to do is bleed it up, which tends to be slightly awkward with rear brakes because it's a very long brake line, and of course your master cylinder is the highest point on the system. So sometimes the air sort of goes forwards and backwards in the pipe and the fluid doesn't move properly, and it can be a bit of a game. But we'll have a crack on and see how it works out. The rear brake is now bled up, so that's decent there. It takes a while because the line's so long, and in the end I realised there was an air bubble at the top of the mass cylinder up here, so I had to take the mass cylinder off, turn it upside down to bleed the air out of that, but while keeping the reservoir upright so we didn't get any air coming in that way. Little bit awkward, but not too bad, and once the air was out the mass cylinder it was job sorted. And I've also run the cable for the span adjuster, so we now have all of the brakes finished. So I think the next thing to do is rear sets. Rear sets fitted. We're in race shift on this side, and then if we pop around the other side, because we don't have a rear brake, we don't actually need the heel plate really, but I'll put it on for now because it's pretty, but Tim might well end up taking that off later, and then because you don't need the bolts or anything. I haven't tightened the foot pegs up until Tim's been, because we'll move those and move the levers and bits, so I don't want to Loctite those in place, but I have Loctited the holding down bolts, holding on bolts even. Right, now, because I have the rear sets on, I have a solid position to put footrest stands, which means I can take the shock out easier. So the next thing is, standard one out, K-Tech one in. Getting the standard shock out is snug, to say the least, but it can come out without too much faffing around. Top and bottom shock bolts out, and then I found you can sort of twist it and then pop it out the side of the subframe, and it does come out okay. To get the new shock in, it was actually easy to take an extra bit of the shock linkage out down here, and I took that bolt out as well and swung the linkage down. It just gave you a bit more room, but getting the K-Tech shock in was relatively straightforward. They even come with spacers so you can fit the preload adjuster under there, so that's actually quite nice and neat. I like that under there. The only game is there is a bypass adjuster under there. Don't get me wrong, you don't adjust the bypass adjuster very often because it's for very slow speed damping. It's really for the wet. But you're never going to get to it under there without either drilling a hole through the under tray or taking the shock out. So it is basically pointless now. But the rest of the adjusters are nice and easy to get to. The shock, interestingly, is 3mm longer, as K-Tech have sent it, than the standard shock, but we're going to try it like that to begin with. Now, I did notice that the standard sax shock looks a lot like an Öhlins. It's a similar colour. the rebound adjuster on the bottom is almost exactly the same as an old school Öhlins, and it's even got a ride out adjuster. So that is a surprisingly adjustable shock for a base model bike. Nice. So it's been relatively productive so far today. I've got quite a lot of the other bits done, and realistically the only things left to do are oil and filter the engine, stick some GB covers on it, some carbon frame covers on it, and a few little niceties like GoPro mounts and stuff. So there is not very much left at all to do to the bike. And instead of finishing it now, which is exactly what I should be doing, I'm going to go flat tracking at Champions Flat Track School because it's fun. Right, final morning on Tim's Aprilia. Not that much to do. Yeah, right. I say that. I'm always going to find little project bits to do, little tinker ones, little bits of tidying up. I say that, you know, just needs an oil and filter changes and covers putting on it. I'm going to be here hours, I bet. I know how this works. So I'm going to start with an oil and filter change, so oil, filter, fairly straightforward. We're also changing the standard, quite crap looking plastic crash cover things, and I think they're probably more of an emissions thing to keep the noise down. We're changing them for some proper GB racing engine covers which will crash much better if Tim decides to crash it. Then there is a set of carbon frame and swinging arm covers to go on it, a different filler cap, and a few little details to just tick off the list. While the old oil drains out, I am prepping up a new oil filter and just basically priming it with a bit of oil, and the oil we're using will of course be Motel's finest 300V 1050. The V4 engines used to run 1040, but now Aprilia say to run 1050, so we've got a bit of the good stuff to go in it. Oil filter's priming up. When that finishes dribbling, we'll put the new stuff in. So that is an RSV4 frame, and I think they look lovely in the standard plain aluminium finish. I think they look really cool. This is a carbon fibre frame cover, and it's a very nice carbon frame cover. It's not these gloss nonsense. It's a nice satin finish, nice consistent weave on it. It's lovely, but I don't know whether this is an improvement over that. Cosmetically, personally, I prefer the original aluminium finish. Tim prefers the carbon look. I also have another bit of a moment on this. Right, on a race bike, I wouldn't fit carbon frame covers because you're actually adding weight. It's carbon fibre, it doesn't weigh very much, but you're adding weight still when you don't need to. But this isn't a race bike, this is a track day bike, so this is okay. And basically, it's for cosmetics. Now, if the bike was destined to maybe one day go back on the road or as a protection thing, excellent idea, because it stops anything getting damaged. And if I was doing that, what I would do is I'd fit underneath some little foam pads, and I would actually cable tie this onto the frame because it's relatively easy to get off and it won't mark the frame. This bike is not going back on the road. This is going to be purely track bike. So these, by Tim's request, are actually getting stuck on. So I have some silicone adhesive. I'm going to give them a fairly good coating underneath, and I'm going to stick it to the frame. Although on the other side, because it's not for this side, I picked the wrong one out of the bag. I blooming love the noise that these things make. They just sound awesome. I love Aprilias. Rah! Having run the bike up to temperature and double check the oil level, we've got enough lovely Motel in it, so I am going to lock wire the dipstick and the filler cap, because the new titanium race bolt sump plug is lock wired to the oil filler, oil filter even. So that's all tidied away, so I've just got to drill and lock wire those bits. I have had to remove one of the riv nuts out of the rear subframe where the seat bolt's down, because the bolt had seized in it. That's the third bolt on this bike I've actually had to drill out, which is a bit of a faff. And then I found another thing, which is a bit of a faff. I have also fitted lever guards. Normally I would mock people for running a clutch side lever guard, because you don't need it. If somebody hits your clutch, what's the worst that's really going to happen? But, being as we have a brake on this lever, on this handlebar now, Tim wants it. Admittedly, if they jam that brake on when you hit them, you're not going over the handlebars, but you're not going to be having a very good day, so that is sort of sensible. Right, onto the faff. The faff is, if I put it in lock, The steering damper, which is specific to this bike, and I will mention to this to the K-Tech lads, hits the air tube. So what I need to do is modify the air tube so that this doesn't hit it, because you can't actually fit a shorter damper, certainly not a shorter K-Tech one. So I need to mod this so that we can actually put the bike in lock without hitting things. It's actually even worse with the fairing on because it holds those a little bit closer together. So I've marked on there, and what I'm going to try first is see if I can warm this up and see if the plastic will go soft and push out the way. What are the chances of that working? So what we've done here is warm this up with a heat gun and then use the ball peen end of a hammer to like push the plastic out of place a little bit. And that one was first attempt. It's not the neatest thing, but luckily you don't really see it, and I might just warm it up and push the top edge in a little bit to tidy it up. But it has moved the plastic out of the way, so what I'm going to do is refit it, put the top fairing on as well so it holds the air tubes in exactly the right place, and actually see if we've got enough clearance. If not, we'll warm it up, push it a little bit further. But it looks considerably better than cutting holes in it and then trying to fill it in from the back. So Tim has been down to check foot peg positions, gear lever position, which he's happy with, and lever positions at the front. And he's happy with the handlebars, but wanted this brake lever a little bit lower, which is no problem, except that means I've had to trim a little bit out the fairing there because it hits the bottom of the lever, and I've had to do the warming up the air tube thing into there. So that side's all tucked away, and this has involved taking the top fairing on and off 20 odd times, trying to work out exactly what touches and just tickle it just enough out of the way because you don't want to take too much material off. And then and then of course you get that bit to fit, and it hits the air scoop, not the fairing, so you take the air, they take it. Right, it carries on. But anyway, we now have clearance both sides. Not a lot of clearance, but there is clearance, so it's fine. Right, he's happy with gear lever positions. I've fitted the front sprocket protector. Basically, if it chucks the chain, it doesn't damage the cases, so that's a case protector, and it incorporates as well a bearing that supports the input shaft for a more positive gear change. So that's fitted. The carbon is held on currently with cable ties until the adhesive sets, so they're on. I'm going to stick with saying I preferred it with the aluminium frame. Tim loves the carbon, so it's each their own, even if he is wrong. I've also been out to the back of the bike and fitted the most important thing of all for every track day, GoPro mount. So that's a Kelfab GoPro mount. The camera will stick on the back and go backwards or forwards if he wants to look at the back of his leg. So right, we are nearing completion now. We even have pretty colours on the buttons that Tim picked for himself. And so all I've got to do now really is put the fairing on it. Win-win. Finally, after considerably more than just a couple of hours in the morning, this thing is actually finished, other than I'm going to put the belly pan on after I've taken it off the bench, because some stuff, if it sits really low, clips to the front of my bench, and we don't want to be doing that now. So it looks really, really cool. We've even got black Zeus fasteners and black screws for the fairing, so that everything matches correctly. It's got easy grips on there, that in my opinion aren't quite as good as stomp grips, and I don't get paid by either of these people, so it's absolutely fine. I can say what I like. All the shiny bits are on, the matte bits are on, the more shiny bits are on, the noisy bits on, the colourful bits all on, and everything appears to work, hopefully, which is rather a good job because Tim's going to Spain on it in a couple of days. So that's it. The RSV4 is finished and it is ready to go out for a trip to Spain. This thing is going to ride lovely and sound awesome, and I'm a little bit jealous because I have a bit of a soft spot for these. But thank you for watching, and join me again next time for some more motorbike fun. If you want a track bike building, setting up, servicing, or you just want to have a look at some of our lovely merch, check out obsessionengineering.co.uk.